Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I am the International Studies Association's Director of Professional Development. And thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on the 2024 presidential election. And the purpose of our discussion today is really to understand the results and what they mean for going forward. And so to that end, this discussion is really designed to be interactive, and I encourage you to write any of your questions in the chat or the Q&A feature. After the panelists give us some background information and some things to consider, they'll take time to answer any of these questions. So joining us today, we have Julia Azari. She is a professor of political science at Marquette University, and she also writes at the Substack, Good Politics, Bad Politics. John Sides is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Vanderbilt University and the publisher of Good Authority, which is the successor to the Monkey Cage. We also have Nadia Brown. She is a professor of government and the chair of the Women's and Gender Studies program at Georgetown University. And we also have, finally, we have Jordan Tama. He is Provost Associate Professor in the School of International Service at American University and Senior Director of Bridging the Gap. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I'm now going to turn it over to Julia.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you so much for including me on this amazing panel, amazing lineup. I'm going to talk a little bit. Essentially, my remarks converged on this idea of Trump as a former president running for president, which is a pretty unusual situation. And I want to start by thinking about this from an electoral perspective. And one of, I think, the really big puzzles that has been weighing on my mind since Tuesday is how did Trump, someone who's typically not been terribly popular and has sort of built his career insulting various groups. How did he actually improve his performance with, I think, every group, most groups, and improve his performance in urban areas and all that kind of thing? And I think one of the things that we're seeing is actually the intersection of two political phenomena. And one is really familiar, which is that this campaign had really aimed to frame the election around a retrospective kind of way of thinking about politics, and I think they were pretty successful. So if you just look at the fundamentals, if you just look at perceptions of the economy and Biden's lack of popularity, low approval ratings, you predict a pretty bad election for the incumbent party. And I think that's a pretty clear and straightforward explanation of what happened. But what's interesting there is that Trump himself was, was the non-beneficiary, was a victim of such a phenomenon 4 years ago. I think there is something to be said about general anti-incumbency, and a lot will be said about that, and this seems to be a global phenomenon. But I think it also intersected with something really interesting, which is the romanticism of the ex-president. And interestingly enough, given this unique situation, I haven't actually seen a lot of takes that really address this. And there's some data. There's a good number of surveys about evaluations of ex-presidents. So, for example, I'm going to sort of run through these in a not especially systematic way. But in 2012, there was a survey that suggested that all living ex-presidents except for George W. Bush had majority support, or majority kind of approval. That includes people who had not won re-election, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush has had a resurgence in public view since then. Obama in 2020, so thinking about this sort of 4 years after they've left office, Obama was one of the most popular figures. A recent poll in, I think, October suggested that a majority would have voted for Obama if he were eligible to run. Bill Clinton, I think, probably would have won a third term in 2000. And Gallup did a kind of extensive retrospective survey, and Clinton actually was one of the few presidents that slipped, but was still remains pretty popular. Trump gained 12 points in a retrospective survey in 2023 from where he was at when he left office. So I think the intersection of not being happy with the status quo and the romanticism of looking back on how things were some years ago really helped Trump with numerous groups of voters, and I think that helps explain that kind of uniform shift. I also think for Trump this is especially potent because of the nature of the status quo. because he served kind of during the period between the Great Recession and the pandemic, and compared with the kind of chaos of post 2021 life, I think it's quite easy for people to view the Trump years as better. So I think we should view those two trends in tandem. How am I on time, Sarah? Okay, so the second piece I want to talk about is the Grover Cleveland parallel, which I'm going to think about a little bit more this afternoon. And here I just want to kind of begin brainstorming. I'd initially promised to talk about intra-party dynamics, and there's much to be said about the Democrats as well. But I actually want to really dig in very briefly to the only other non-consecutive president in U.S. history. So Grover Cleveland actually shares some interesting similarities with Trump. He was kind of seen as a little bit of a sleazy figure who's a business, pro-business figure from New York, um, and was kind of perpetually on the outs with his own party, especially on policy issues. Dragged his party to the right as a Democrat on the gold issue, which became a pretty significant source of contention in the Democratic Party. So, but more broadly speaking, the Democratic Party in the 1880s and 1890s, you had a party that was coming off of having been the more racially regressive party. So they had a kind of racially extreme faction in the South, and then a pro-business faction in the North. And this starts to kind of sound familiar. And the reason I think it's significant is Cleveland ran 3 times. He ran in 1884 and won, 1888, lost in the Electoral College, and then 1892 and won that second non-consecutive term. Why did they keep nominating him? He wasn't a terribly popular figure, either in the party or nationally, but he was kind of the only person that could pull that off. It's the only person that the party could find that was broadly acceptable to these really disparate factions in a kind of troubled party that had been repudiated nationally kind of decades before. And I think that there are some stories here about that are interesting to think about whether this is also happening with Trump, about whether he's also such a figure in the GOP coalition, and whether he also might be a figure, as it seems to potentially be the case, one of the few figures who's able to command a national Republican majority in a presidential election through a long period of time. It looks like that will likely be the case when we count all of the popular votes, that Trump will have won a national majority. But I think it should not be discounted that that hasn't happened in a long time, and think about what kind of figure this is. The final piece I'll say about Cleveland is that he's very much representative of a period nationally and in the party when people were turning to the economy and economic concerns and turning to immigration concerns, specifically abandoning the sort of failed racial reckoning after the Civil War. And I think that sort of turn in salience also provides us with some historical precedent, particularly when we look at divisions within the Democratic Party between their historical strength with white immigrant groups, with Irish and German and other immigrant groups, and those groups very vocal opposition to Chinese immigrants. And so you had a turn away from immigration, a conservative turn on immigration, just as we're seeing now. And the intra-party dynamics for the Democratic Party were very much between immigrant groups. And I think that is one way we can kind of dig into some of the data and evidence that we're looking at now about the way different groups have voted in 2024.
Okay, thank you. John?
Thanks, everyone, and thank you for having me. Um, I want to say 4 things, basically. The first is I want to amplify what Julia said about the election being essentially a retrospective assessment of the incumbent party. This is what's happened to every incumbent party in developed countries since the pandemic. They've all lost vote share. So the US is no different. Biden's approval rating in June, which was about 38%, would have forecast a 3-point loss for the Democrats in the national popular vote. Guess where they are? Almost exactly there. So in a sense, like, the story of this election is very boring. Unpopular incumbent party loses re-election. It's the same thing that happened in 2020, like Julia also said. So we don't need to go a lot further than that, to be honest with you. I mean, that's Occam's razor, right? It explains the US, it explains these other countries. We don't have to to go into a lot of detail about all of the things that commentators and politicians are debating right now, such as, right, was it foreign policy? Was it Israel? Since I'm at ISA, let's talk about foreign policy, right? You know, there was obviously some losses for Harris that it concentrated in predominantly Muslim and Arab American areas around Dearborn, Michigan. Sure, for those people, I think that it is possible that this was a central issue. And then that's why like Jill Stein got some extra votes in those precincts. But I mean, let's be clear, like that's not the reason that Trump won Michigan. They're not a large enough percentage of the population to make the difference. In general, voters don't do a good job connecting policy to their vote. That's very hard. Foreign policy is not necessarily ever very salient. I would say that about a lot of policy issues, not just foreign policy in this election. The other thing it means is that it's not to be put on Harris. And already we're starting to see reporting like the Biden people are blaming the Harris people, the Harris people are blaming the Biden people. And Democrats are good at blaming each other. But like, let's be real, you know, within 3 months' time, her popularity went up. She was more popular than Trump. She raised a bunch of money. She ran a professional campaign. You know, she backed away from stances that she had taken in the 2020 primary that might not have been as popular. She moderated. Well, she wasn't persuasive, whatever, right? She did about as good as the fundamentals would have led her to do. And I think that's a testament to the fact that, like, you know, candidates and campaigning don't make a huge difference in presidential general elections the way they can make a difference down the ballot, as you saw with some of these Democratic Senate incumbents winning re-election in states that Trump actually won. Campaigning at most has a marginal impact on presidential general election outcomes, and she probably out-campaigned Trump just on the metrics, right? I think they were roughly balanced in advertising towards the end of the election, but she clearly had a better ground game. It's possible that helped her lose by less. Like, we don't really know. We have to think at the margins. But at the end of the day, like, if you're losing battleground states by 3 percentage points, there's no way, you know, having a better ground game is going to make up that kind of difference. So this should not lead to the kind of 2016 Democratic postmortem, which blamed Clinton for her message, for not going to Wisconsin enough. I mean, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think Harris fixed a lot of what people thought Clinton did wrong, and she still loses. And that just shows it's hard when you're, you know, sailing into the headwinds that are created by a spike in inflation and an unpopular president in your own party. Some people are really focused on subgroups of the electorate and Latinos in particular. I think there's evidence, as Julia said, that Trump gained support in lots of places, lots of groups. This is not a story about a large-scale realignment with some groups shifting towards the Democrats and some groups shifting towards the Republicans. 2016 looked like that. 2024 does not look like that. What's going on with Latinos? We'll have an interview with Yumil Velez, a scholar of Latino politics, tomorrow at Good Authority, who wrote the best piece, I think, about what happened in 2020 with Latinos. And it's part of a broader ideological sorting that's going on. And the Latinos who are moving to the Republican Party are sometimes characterized as working class. That may be sort of true, like descriptively, but it's not really the major thing that's happening. What they are is conservative. And they're conservative on immigration to some extent, on racial issues to some extent, as well as perhaps other issues beyond that. So we can't say with any certainty which issue is driving them to the Republican Party, but what we can say is that what's happening with Latinos is basically a microcosm of what's happened with the broader electorate over the last several decades. Yamil talks a little bit in the interview about maybe the declining salience of immigration relative to other issues was helpful to Trump in 2020 and again in 2024. So 2020 is the economy and COVID, 2024 is the inflation in the economy. 2016, you know, inflation was a little bit more front and center in the way that Trump and Clinton were focused. So that may have given Latinos sort of a different kind of permission structure, as it were. But we also shouldn't interpret their support for Trump as a support for everything that Trump has advocated. And there's lots of polling among Latinos that shows that, like, the majority of Latinos wants a path to citizenship. The majority of Latinos doesn't necessarily want deportation of illegal immigrants, particularly when it's actually defined for them what he means by that. This leads to my last point, and then I'll turn it over to Nadia. But Julia warned about this in a piece that was published around Election Day. And I was in the middle of sending some cranky tweets when I needed to jump on this call, because there's already commentators saying it's a center-right nation. That's Mark Penn, the former Clinton pollster, there's already more conservative voices, claiming that this shows that voters of all stripes repudiated the progressive activists and the blah, and Democrats need to grapple with blah blah blah. I mean, good Lord, how many decades of political science do we need before we stop interpreting elections as ideological mandates? It's not what's happening. So I think what the irony of this is what's going to happen if Trump does do what he's promised to do and move policy in the direction he wants, is he's going to experience a opposite shift in public opinion. So the public that was suddenly center right and want all these conservative policies will move in the opposite direction, become more center left and want liberal policies. And so, and then the commentators who called the election an ideological mandate will be suddenly quiet. So I would really caution against interpreting things that way. And notice, like, that's true of every election. It's not just about, when Trump wins, we say this when Obama wins. Like, it's not about ideology fundamentally. So I would really caution against that kind of assessment. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to hear what Nadia and Jordan have to say.
All right. Oh, thank you. So far, just listening to John and Julia has already made my heart smile. As I'm sure our people that are listening today, or have already interacted with their students yesterday, or maybe I have just been feeling just a somber sense, feeling disappointed or frustrated. And the number of really disappointed and angry, frustrated messages that are going on in my various group chats, as well as the emails I'm getting from my students. Like, just hearing this smart and accurate political science take is what I think is so important. And I'm thankful to you, Sarah, for putting this together, because I think this is exactly what the nation needs right now. And those that are on the call, and hopefully it'll be amplified, right? But I think it's just so important to kind of be the adults of the room and tamper down on some of the bad stuff that's going around that's making people feel way more in their feelings than they should be. And so, speaking about feelings, I want to talk about a piece that was published with some co-authors of mine in Good Authority last Friday. And the piece is about blame, and how do we think about, like, the emotional, the American and the emotional response that Americans like to do post-election is turn around and find someone to blame. And the piece that we wrote, I'm very glad that it was able to be published before then, was on this dichotomy of thinking about Black voters as either the saviors of democracy or the scapegoats when democracy goes wrong. And as you know, in the popular media space, all what the pundits are talking about is, who do we blame? And the questions are, right, is it Latinos? Is it the working class Latino voters? And I'm glad to hear that this interview will be published tomorrow on Good Authority, because I do think, right, it needs to come back to having an understanding of what scholarship actually says is going on. And so I want to take the time that's allotted to me to reorient ourselves about how easy it is for us to slip into racist and sexist and xenophobic tropes when we want to figure out when our side didn't win. And for Black Americans, it's a binary. It's never Black Americans are seen as modal US citizens, but rather Black women are upheld as the saviors of democracy. Black women are altruistic. They are doing the right thing for the right reason that doesn't necessarily impact them, or that they don't necessarily have skin in the game, but they're going to show up and kind of be this magical Negro that comes out of, thin air to do the organizing, the mobilizing, the community care, the groundwork to deliver a democratic vote. On the other side, right, it's the scapegoating of Black men who are deviant, who are uneducated enough to understand what's good for them and how they should be voting, and aren't true keepers of democracy. And so we saw this already, kind of the lead up, which I was so happy that the piece was able to be published before the election, because I hoped that it would kind of like dissuade whatever was going to come out post-election, is that if Kamala Harris would have won, Black women would have been held up again, right, as these saviors of democracy, without really thinking about, well, what did Black women want? What are the things that Black women have done to lead to this win? the groundwork was already being laid to show that Black men were moving towards Republicans, and that if Harris were to lose, we needed to have a real honest conversation about the role of a misogynoir and hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity in Black communities that were prohibiting Black men from supporting Black women. What was missing right at the heart of this analysis is that one, Black people are rational political actors, just like anybody else, right? And so race doesn't have to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room at all times, right? There are other motivating factors that lead Black people to have policy preferences. Another misnomer, right, is that all Black people should be Democrats. While right, the history and why Black Americans tend to vote Democratic is due to the policy preferences and treatment of the Democratic Party as compared to the Republican Party. But here's the gotcha. Having party capture isn't good for any group, right? And so what this essentially means is that Republicans can do very little to pick up Black voters. Democrats can do very little to maintain Black voters. That's not healthy for democracy, right? And so if the complaints are that Kamala Harris didn't do as well with her base, and we're going to blame Black men and a couple of Black women who decided that they were not going to be this ardent supporters of the Democratic Party, what it fails at seeing is that how parties as a political institution don't do very well on motivating Black voters to turn out to vote, right? They are either the afterthoughts or they are just taken for granted. That's not healthy for democracy. And so when I'll stop here, but the point that I would love us to think more about is how particularly do minoritized groups get talked about in politics in these either or ways that are really steeped in racist, sexist, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic tropes that don't give people an agency, right? To see that they can actually show up to American democracy with policy preferences, the political opinions that might not be a monolith, but that it's not them. They're not the problem, right? Racism, sexism is a bug. It isn't a bug in American democracy. It is a feature. And so pitting groups one another to say one group wins or one group loses, because the system itself is set up to be one that's built on white heteropatriarchal supremacy, doesn't give these groups a lot of leverage. And so I hope that listening to this talk today and the kind of conversations leads us to be the adults in the room. And instead of asking questions that tend to point fingers back on marginalized groups, instead we think about ways that we can open up democracy to be full and participatory for all.
All right. Thank you, Nadia. Jordan?
Okay. It's great to be on this panel with three fantastic scholars. And John briefly touched on foreign policy, but so far the conversation hasn't been focused in that area. And I'll emphasize the implications of the election for America's role in the world. And I'll try to do that by making some broad points about kind of big picture US role in the world, and then get into some specific policy shifts that we are likely to see under Trump. So broadly, I think the big story here from the election is that it continues a shift away from the brand of internationalism that has defined much of US foreign policy since World War II. Trump is really the only president since World War II who is not an internationalist, who fundamentally does not believe that America benefits from deeper cooperation with other countries, and that when other countries are doing better, the United States is also doing better. He sees the world instead in zero-sum terms, that if other countries are doing better, that's bad for the United States. And our job is to outcompete other countries rather than to cooperate with other countries to kind of address shared challenges. And that's a fundamental shift from where US foreign policy has been for 75 years. And that translates into different orientations on issues, including the role of alliances. Trump is our only president since Harry Truman who has not valued alliances as a useful instrument of US foreign policy. He does not value close cooperation with democracies. democracy as a shared value is not something that's important to him, and he generally is more interested in cooperating with authoritarian leaders than with democratic leaders. He's not interested in global cooperation through institutions to address shared problems like climate change. And he is a protectionist at heart, and favors steps to reduce economic openness, to limit immigration. These are all shifts from the broad contours of U.S. foreign policy over the past 75 years. Some implications for other countries that are looking at the United States. Well, for longstanding Democratic allies and partners, Trump's election reduces confidence in America's reliability as a partner. The United States looks much less reliable as a partner to other countries in the Trump era than it did before. This creates incentives for some of our longstanding allies and partners to look to alternatives to U.S. leadership, and in some cases that can mean, considering partnership with other countries who they might feel like they can rely on more, or building up their own capabilities to kind of defend themselves independently of the United States and Europe. There will now be more talk of developing European military capability as a means of giving Europe more autonomy from the United States. For autocrats overseas, authoritarian leaders, Trump's election gives them confidence of a few things. It gives them confidence that, one, they can interfere effectively in U.S. elections. So we saw Russia, but not only Russia, interfering in this election, and so far doing so without meaningful cost. Russia sees this as, a very successful campaign. They helped Trump get elected, and they're not going to pay any significant price for that. And that also sends a message to other authoritarian governments, China, Iran, others, that this is a policy instrument that is worth pursuing, interfering in U.S. elections. That's very troubling. It also sends a signal to authoritarian leaders, in other parts of the world, that publics seem to be okay with democratic backsliding, that movements toward authoritarianism don't necessarily turn off voters. We've seen that in other countries, and we see that in the United States. And it gives them confidence that they can trade favors with the U.S. Because Trump is a transactional leader. It doesn't matter to him whether you're a dictator or a Democrat. If you have something to offer him, he's going to, want to think about making a deal with you, even if what's being offered is unsavory or contrary to, longstanding U.S. values. So those are some broad contours on some specific policy issues. We'll see shifts on U.S. policy toward the war in Ukraine and Russia. Trump says he's going to, end the war in 24 hours. Well, that's not going to happen, but he is going to certainly pursue diplomacy with Vladimir Putin to try to make a deal that he can treat as a major achievement. He is somebody who, I think, in general in foreign policy, will be seeking some kind of major diplomatic achievement in his second term as presidency, and Russia will be the kind of first place where he looks to that. The problem, of course, is that, what it takes to reach a deal with Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine is to give Russia or agree to Russian claims of control over parts of Ukraine that Russia has conquered. And so Trump is going to be open to giving Russia control of parts of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is obviously going to be very unhappy with that, and that's going to be a source of tension now between the United States and Ukraine. NATO, well, Trump is going to weaken the U.S. role in NATO. I don't think he'll fully pull out of NATO, because that's not necessary, and that would generate some more significant backlash domestically, because domestically, NATO still has strong support from the American public. But he can do a lot of things to weaken the U.S. role in NATO without fully pulling out of the organization. Climate change, well, Trump is not going to do anything to address climate change, and it'll be much harder for there to be any kind of meaningful international cooperation to address climate change. tariffs, he's talked about putting in place some massive tariffs. Whether he will go to the max on that in the ways that he's discussed, I don't know. I think he'll probably be, strongly advised not to put in place 20% tariffs on imports, because that will generate, very high inflation and create large economic costs in the United States. But he's certainly going to do something on tariffs, because he's talked about that so much. The last point I would make is how his return to the presidency will weaken the infrastructure for foreign policy. And this is going to be true in other policy areas as well. But here I'm worried about two things in general. One, a loss of expertise and experience from within the executive branch. Agencies are going to get hollowed out because he is going to, as he did to some extent in his first term, not value the role that they play, and put pressure on agencies to be, just loyal to his agenda, and create a tone that is unwelcome to professional civil servants. So there'll be a loss of expertise and experience in the foreign policy agencies like the State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development. They'll be hollowed out. And then agencies will be politicized, and that'll include the foreign policy agencies. He's going to, appoint people who are more likely than the people who he appointed in his first term to be political loyalists, to take actions that are partisan in their nature, and that sort of inject partisanship into the bureaucracy in a deep way. And if the Republicans control both chambers of Congress, as it looks like they're going to, it's not likely there are going to be, checks on the way he manages the executive branch. And so I'm worried about how he will kind of corrode, hollow out, corrupt parts of the executive branch during the next 4 years in foreign policy and in other areas.
Okay, thank you so much, Jordan. So we already have a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So we can get started with those. And if you have a question, please do ask it. We have plenty of time. So the first question, I think, would be for you, Jordan. How will another Trump presidency influence the current world order with Russia, China, and Iran?
Well, I think there's a question there about world order, and then a question about some specific countries. I think in terms of world order, the presidency sort of adds to a shift that's already been in motion now over the past 10 years or so, of movement away toward away from globalization, interconnection, integration, cooperation as kind of the modal trajectory of international politics. That was the trajectory that was sort of dominant in the early post-Cold War years under, in part leadership from internationalist American presidents. And we're seeing a retreat from that as there's been this rise of populism, nationalism, authoritarianism in many parts of the world. With regard to Russia, I think, the implications of Trump's presidency is greater prospect for some cooperation between the US and Russia. But the worry is that will be on Russia's terms, because cooperation with Russia right now is likely to mean the United States giving Russia what it wants. For instance, agreeing to Russian, permanent control over parts of Ukraine that Russia has conquered, which is fundamentally contrary to core principles of international order, that you can't, conquer another country. With regard to China, there'll be more continuity between Biden and Trump. Biden has had a tough stance toward China, broadly speaking. Trump has a tough stance toward China, broadly speaking. Both Biden and Trump favor steps to compete more effectively with China, counter the rise of Chinese influence. Biden kept in place some of the tariffs that Trump had put in place on China, and Biden's done a lot of other things to kind of compete more with China. And Trump will, I think, continue to move policy in that direction, but with some harsher elements, for instance, and some more potentially dramatic elements if he, puts in place heavy tariffs. At the same time, Trump admires Xi Jinping just as the way he admires Vladimir Putin. So for Xi Jinping, it offers an opportunity to make some deals with Trump. And as Kamala Harris, I think, very accurately said during the campaign, Trump can be influenced through favor and flattery, and authoritarian leaders are well aware of that. And so, you can look to Xi Jinping and the Chinese government to be trying to use favors and flattery to kind of get Trump to agree to things that they want. Iran, I mean, the relationship with Iran is going to remain quite confrontational. And I think there's, certainly a risk of more, militarized conflict between the U.S. and Iran in the coming months, in the same way as we've already seen to some extent in the last several months with, Israel, Iran tension being the, direct source of conflict, but with the U.S. intervening on the side of Israel, helping Israel defend itself. I think, there's a good chance we'll see more of that, and that certainly could escalate and bring the U.S. into direct conflict with Iran.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about U.S. cybersecurity. So how do you anticipate U.S. cybersecurity foreign policy changing under this new administration?
I don't anticipate much change on that. I think cybersecurity is an issue that's not really very politicized right now, thankfully. I mean, everybody supports cybersecurity. So I don't know, John maybe can think of polling data on, do you support stronger cybersecurity measures? I think you'd have, more than 90% of Americans saying yes. So overall, this isn't an area where there's, polarization or contentiousness in our politics, but there is contentiousness around certain dimensions of what you might broadly think of as cybersecurity. So, for instance, foreign election interference. There's a cybersecurity element there. I, would expect U.S. intelligence agencies in the coming months before the end of the Biden administration to be putting out some reports about foreign election interference in this election, and that could be a source of contentiousness in the sense that they may, make recommendations for how the United States should better protect itself from foreign election interference, and Trump may dismiss all that as a, partisan effort to smear his victory in the 2024 election. But overall, that's not an area where there's, a ton of contentiousness.
So there is a question on the idea of systemic change. And so this person writes, perhaps the signal from the electorate that the U.S. constitutional system as it stands is no longer viewed to be something that serves the citizens of this country. As a result, they elected a person that is as anti-establishment as Trump, who seems very comfortable with breaking the established system. What do you think of this idea of broad popular support for systemic change?
I mean, I'll tackle that. I mean, everything depends on what the word systemic change means and what the phrase constitutional system means and what the word establishment means, because I don't think there's any easy answer here. The public, majority of Americans will always sort of say things like, oh yeah, let's change, we need change. And a lot of Americans are not necessarily committed to certain principles and norms that we think of as being enshrined in the Constitution, if what we mean by the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. But that's not new. That's really been true for most of American history. So I don't really see Trump's election as some indication that the public wants systemic change on all these kinds of fronts. I don't think the public really knows what it wants. Now, Trump is going to, not going to change the Constitution in the literal sense of like amending it. Trump will, in some disrespect norms the way he has for his entire, political career. Whether that actually appeals to voters, I don't. That's very unclear to me. A lot of what Trump does and says creates controversy and backlash, and counter-mobilization. Now, I don't know that it'll be quite as much of that as there was in 2017, but it's not clear to me that there's any kind of mandate for change, that the public really wants it, that the public knows what it wants, that they're actually going to get what they want, or actually not like what he's doing. I tend to think of the sort of Trump versus the establishment thing as so like poorly defined in the public's mind, that it's not really clear that there's a real implication of a Trump victory in this general category, for better or worse.
Julia,
Can I add something to that? Yeah. I think, I mean, I agree with John about the broad view of public opinion, and I think it's very challenging to take some of this anti-incumbent data that we have and draw a firm conclusion about whether this is a reaction to sort of immediate circumstances or a kind of deeper sense of dissatisfaction with the system and with politics in general. And I think there's sort of evidence either way. But some of the evidence for the latter, that there is a deeper systemic dissatisfaction in US politics, is, I think, our consistent level of institutional distrust. And I think the other piece of data that's quite relevant there has to do with economic inequality and the ways in which economic recoveries and periods of good economic times have kind of unequal impacts. I think I also want to put this in some kind of deeper historical context, and this is I'm going to obnoxiously promote something I wrote on my Substack a couple of weeks ago. It was a piece about how stronger parties could address the crisis of American democracy, and one of the things that I wanted to get at was this idea of realignment. And I'm not saying Tuesday was a realignment. I don't really think that that's true or put a lot of weight in realignments necessarily. But the most interesting thing about published theory on realignments, which goes back to the 50s and the 70s when those sort of crucial works were written, is actually based on this idea that American politics by design is not very responsive. That in that sense, it's because of all the checks, all the sort of checks and balances and veto points. It's this idea that American politics does not really reflect shifts in public opinion in real time, or address public needs in real time. And so it's the words that Walter Dean Burnham used to describe this it was something like boiling point, flashpoint. I don't know if that's entirely an accurate description of what happened now, but I think it's an interesting idea to have in our minds about the ways in which the system isn't responsive. But to bring, I think to bring basically what John just said into an institutional framework, what I would say is it's really important to be specific about what elements of the system aren't working and what kind of systemic changes would help, because it's all systemic change is not created equal. And the other piece of that I think is crucial to pay attention to is also historical. And also, I think, really lays the groundwork for the way that Trump has presented himself as a presidential figure. And that is to frame the presidency as an office that can cut through all of these institutional barriers to change. And that really goes back, I mean, kind of to Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and that kind of era. And it has created a much empowered presidency. And I would recommend Sidney Milkus's work on this in his recent book with Nicholas Jacobs on this topic that's more focused on Trump and on executive partisanship. But I think I think it's really important to keep these things in our mind as scholars as we think about how to advocate for systemic change or how to think about translating public preferences, is to think the kind of throwing it all out mentality does not have a great track record either here in the US or in other contexts.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question about misogyny. What role do you think misogyny played in general, not specific to marginalized groups, but across the board?
Right, so perhaps I can take this one. So Trump ran a highly people can refer to it as a hyper-masculine campaign, that he really dove deep into playing up the just how strong, how tough, how patriarchal he would be as a leader. And that isn't new, right? We've seen Trump play that hyper-masculine role in, all three of these his presidential election terms. But I think what was probably more surprising is how Kamala Harris didn't take the bait, which was something that was different than Donald Trump. I'm sorry, that was different than Joe Biden. If you remember, during one of their debates, threatened to take him behind the studio and stage and take him out back and go a couple of rounds with them. And Hillary Clinton, who was actively annoyed, right? And wrote much, talked a lot of that and wrote some of this later in her memoirs about just how pissed off and angry she was at how Trump ran this hyper-masculine campaign against her. Kamala Harris took a different route. She didn't respond directly to the things that he said, right? Rather, she used his words against him, right? Rather than taking them personally. So we could think about, right, how he called her low IQ and made fun of the way that she, laughed and all these kind of gendered ways that he tried to bait her. She didn't take it at all. Some of her surrogates took it on, but she did not. But I think that so this gives me two thoughts here. One, right, is this the route that women that are seeking elected office should go? Is to kind of, let the misogynist be a misogynist and think that people are smart enough to see those sexist catcalls or dog whistles and put that over to the side because it doesn't have to deal with policy or anything that really will impact the campaign, which is what Kamala Harris did? Or do you take it directly, face on? And I don't know that we are in a position because we have, small case studies, to really look this, because American politics have been, at least at the federal level, have been so overwhelmingly white and male that we only have, right, these three case studies, and those have been in recent times. But it does beg the question of what are candidates, what should they do when they're baited around misogyny and sexism? But the other part is, how are voters responding to this? And so we saw that those hyper masculine and, in my mind, they were really toxic masculinity on display was something that appealed to voters, right? And particularly appealed to voters who saw themselves as disadvantaged by other systems of oppression, right? Maybe it's racism, maybe it's nativity, maybe it's religious orientation. But they were able to tap into patriarchy, right? And they were able to tap into the privilege that being male gives one in American society. And so it just reminds me, right, that we know that racism train is never late, right? That's always on brand for American politics. We talk a lot less about misogyny, but I think that train is also running on time. And so we should have larger conversations that we don't talk as much about because they've been placed on individual candidates. So we could think about, well, was Hillary Clinton a flawed candidate? And is that why we saw Donald Trump behaving in these ways? Or is Donald Trump a flawed candidate and he's, maybe himself so low IQ that he doesn't have the the bandwidth or the vocabulary or whatever it might be to be able to debate people based on policies instead of personal attacks, whatever it is. But what it shows is that it works on American public, right? And there's something about misogyny that gets people to turn out.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I think that so I think of this, I answer this question sort of three ways in my mind. One is like, do we see it in the way that people are talking in politics? And Nadia is obviously correct, right? That there's a lot of that misogynistic language in the way that Trump talks, the way that people around Trump talk. There's all these calls on Twitter from conservative influencers in the day of the election that men should go vote, men should go vote. So that is clearly true. And this is what women candidates face, right? That's different than what men candidates face. I think part of the reason why it's politicians do it is because I don't know if it helps them per se, but it does not create the backlash that we would like it to create. And you can see that in the gender gap. It's not much different this year than it was in 2020. There's no sort of surge of support for Harris among women that would lead a politician to think, oh, maybe I better tone it down a little bit with the stuff, with the misogyny. And this is to Nadia's earlier point that, when we treat these demographic groups like monoliths, it really does not help us understand the differences among them and why it's the case, as was true in 2016, that like having a woman presidential candidate doesn't lead to like a wholesale shift in the policy preferences or the partisan preferences of women. Michael Tesler has a nice piece of good authority about that, which I'll put in the chat in a minute. The other way to think about misogyny and gender is not just in terms of what the campaigns talk about or what voters who are women or men do, but it's also about like voters' attitudes about gender. And there's a much bigger gap between people who have progressive versus conservative attitudes about gender than there is between men and women. So we sort of pay too much attention to the gender gap generally, not enough attention to the gender attitudes gap. And what's interesting here is that in 2020, of course, like whether you have more or less sexist attitudes was correlated with how you think about political figures and in the typical direction. But it was basically equally correlated with your view of Biden in 2020 and your view of Harris in 2020. And part of what's happened is that I think partially as a consequence of the kinds of rhetoric that Nadia was referring to, gender attitudes are increasingly baked into partisanship. And so you don't need necessarily a woman candidate to activate voters' gender attitudes. Now, it does activate discourse, right? Which, but it doesn't necessarily activate gender attitudes necessarily. I'll say that with a little like grain of salt in the sense that we still have a lot of learning to do about this particular election cycle. So I don't want to say that what we found in 2020 was the same as what it will be this year. But that's another thing to think about here. If gender attitudes are baked into partisanship, right? Like they're going to matter, right? Even if the election wasn't full of misogynistic rhetoric. And we'll see if they mattered more this year than they did in previous years. I'll put a couple links in the chat. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, John. We have a question about what a Trump presidency would mean for Venezuela. So what do you anticipate Trump's approach to Venezuela would be, and what would that mean for Venezuelan Americans?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Trump will have a hardline approach to Venezuela because Venezuela has a left-wing government, the Maduro government. Biden had pursued, possibilities of finding areas of accommodation with the Venezuelan government at points during the past 4 years and easing some sanctions on Venezuela. None of that's going to happen under Trump. And the Venezuelan American community has turned out to be a conservative leaning community that has voted heavily for Republicans, in part because so many of them have come from Venezuela, fleeing the authoritarian left-wing government there, or have family members who have suffered under the Maduro government or before the Chavez government. So this is speaking to the points that were being made earlier by John and Nadia. More one other indication of how Latinos are not a monolith. There are parts of the Latino community in the United States who are actually on the whole fairly conservative. Now Venezuelan Americans are one of those groups in general.
Okay. There is a question about AI. Will the new administration have a significant impact on the way AI tools will be developed and deployed? Unsure?
I mean, it also doesn't feel like, to me, this is as yet a strongly polarized issue, much like cybersecurity, in part because it's a moving target and we don't really know what uses AI will or won't have for elements of foreign policy and national security. I do feel, there certainly are, there are a set of conservative tech people that are like obviously aligned with Trump, but I don't quite know exactly what that implications of that are for AI. I mean, Elon Musk was one of the people that signed the thing that said we should put the brakes on AI because it's going to create like, autonomous robot intelligence that's going to take over the world or whatever. So I don't know exactly what it means that Trump becomes president in this regard.
Mhm.
And I think the implications are much clearer for like crypto and other aspects of sort of emerging, I guess call it technology, where the crypto people are all aligned with Trump, and Trump's changed his mind transactionally, as Jordan said, that all of a sudden crypto is great. But AI is a much less clear issue. And I'll also say the other thing that I think that the question that always arises with Trump is, and Jordan sort of alluded to this before, right? He clearly has goals to change the bureaucracy and to like sort of coerce bureaucrats into supporting him by threatening to take their civil service protections away. And he can do that, right? Like the president can pretty much change the civil service. I don't think there would be any huge constitutional issues there. But at the same time, as Trump observed in his first term, a lot of the bureaucracy is working on its own, and the expertise and that it has, the ability to insulate itself from political control. I mean, that's like American politics 101. Like I teach that to undergrads, in their first year. So I think an interesting question about cybersecurity, AI, right? How much are these issues ones that are really like being dealt with by civil service professionals whose jobs are not necessarily at risk, or even if they are being threatened, kind of still hang on and do their jobs? That is going to be I think one of the biggest questions going forward. And to me, a big, Trump's impact on foreign policy or on other policies in his first term was significantly constrained at times by congressional opposition, by bureaucratic slow walking. How much congressional opposition are there going to be, and to what specifically, right? And then where is bureaucratic inertia going to continue to be an obstacle for Trump, and how much can he overcome that with civil service reform? That's, to me, a very big question. So to me, the specific questions about AI and cybersecurity really lead us into a broader question about the relationship between Trump and the executive branch, between Trump and Congress, and just basically how does policy get sorted out in a system of separated powers.
Okay, thank you, John. So we are pretty much out of time, but I wanted to give each of the panelists a moment just to leave us with some final food for thought. Is there one thing that you'd really like to emphasize after today's discussion? Is there something that you think that the audience should continue to think about independently? Any lessons learned that from this election that we'd like to consider moving forward? So.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go really quickly. The first is there's still races that are not called yet, so we don't know the full breakdown of how much lead the Republicans will have in Congress. And so it's really important to know, right, that yes, Trump is president, there is a Republican Senate, and so there's probably going to be some policies that would not have happened otherwise. But it's also important to know that the Republican Party is not unified. And I don't know that all of the things that Trump is saying, whether they're held up in the courts or through infighting for the Republican Party, I think we could kind of put a little, we can kind of tamper down how we think, how bad things will be. The other is that some good things did happen, right? Depending on your vantage point. Last election, Missouri passed referendums that would aid in minimum wage and paid sick time off. There was also abortion initiatives on state ballots that passed. The Senate will now have 2 Black women serving for the first time ever in the Senate at once. And so some other kind of things have happened that I think that would have been bigger news if it wasn't a Trump repeat.
I'll say, I definitely echo what Nadia said. Like, understanding elections is not just about winning the presidency. It's about understanding what's happening in the other branches of government, which people focus less on, and in the states, right? So like federalism is an important feature of the American political system, clearly. The other thing I would say is that, we live in a very, pretty narrowly divided country, in the sense that the number of Republicans and Democrats in the electorate is pretty similar now. It used to be more Democratic. The balance of power in Congress is pretty narrowly divided. Republicans may have a bit of a systemic edge in the Senate right now, just from sort of malapportionment. But like, nevertheless, it's quite possible that as everyone's sort of saying a little bit, but it gets lost when, we're so focused on Trump winning and Harris losing. Democrats may probably gain seats in 2026, probably gain the House if they don't have it after this election cycle. The Senate's a little tougher road, but, we can sometimes get surprised by midterm outcomes the way we were in 2022. So we're going to see oscillation of political power in the American political system. This is not, it's not going to be like, maybe at the judiciary has, of course, a longer sort of conservative lean, but like, we're going to see things shift back and forth. So I think to take the long view, to take the wide view is to do what Nadia did and said, like, hey, what else happened last night or on Tuesday? And take the long view is even like long, meaning like 2 or 4 years, is to say the configuration of power is going to continue to evolve, and there's every reason to expect it to sort of move back and forth between the two parties. So, what does that mean? I don't know. It's just to say, when we're sort of focused on Trump's win and what it means, and it does mean a lot, it's just, as Jordan said initially, but it's not going to be the case that this is the configuration of power we're going to have for maybe very long.
Yeah, so I dropped my mandates piece in the chat for people to look at, and also links to my 10 years ago book, which looks at the kind of long-term trajectory of mandates. And I really want to mandate claiming. I really want to emphasize that particularly conservative presidents have been really effective at kind of using the concept of an electoral mandate to crowd out political alternatives. And I think we'll hear a lot about this as people talk about Trump winning a majority of votes or a plurality or whatever ends up happening, about the fact that a lot of people have voted for some of his policies that other people in the electorate, a significant number of people, find undemocratic or illiberal or unjust. And I really want to emphasize that just because policies may have won a majority of support or be associated with a candidate that won a majority, that doesn't make opposing them illegitimate. And so I really want to kind of urge people to ask questions about mandate takes, and to really think about this, to both John and Nadia's points, as a complex and dynamic process, and not that Tuesday was somehow this revelation about who America really is, but it was sort of one moment in a very deep and ongoing conversation about what this country is and what it values.
Just kind of briefly offer a takeaway that I think follows from the comments that Nadia, John, and Julia all made, which is that politics is not over in the United States. So I think it may look like, especially from the standpoint of people who study international politics, and now the United States has chosen authoritarianism, or chosen a leader who in many ways, has fascist tendencies, but this doesn't actually mean that politics is finished in the United States. One of Trump's, typically kind of bizarre and also scary comments during the election campaign was that at some of his rallies, he said, vote for me, and this will be the last time you'll ever need to vote, right? Like, what is he exactly trying to say? Hard to know. But no, like, people are going to vote again. There are going to be more elections. I think we can be, confident about that. So in a sense, we're all, I think, offering a somewhat optimistic or hopeful take at a time when we're feeling not very optimistic overall.
Thank you. And that's a really good note to end on, an optimistic note. So thank you, Jordan, Julia, Nadia, and John, for sharing your expertise and your insights. And I'm also thanking you on behalf of the audience, because I don't think you've gotten a chance to see all the positive comments in the chat. And have a wonderful day. Bye now.